Okay, so I think we'll begin. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Amy Sam. I am the Health Education Project Specialist at the Maxwell and Eleanor Blum Patient and Family Learning Center at Mass General Hospital. Today's program is a special collaboration between the Blum Center and Department of Speech, Language, and Swallowing Disorders and Reading Disabilities. Before we officially begin, just wanted to go over a few items with you all. Please note that today's session is being recorded for educational purposes. If you're interested in viewing the recording, feel free to visit the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Please note everyone is in listen-only mode. Everyone has been muted so that we can hear our guest speaker today. If you have a question for the guest speaker, please use the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time for them in the end. Only Blum Center staff and the guest speaker will see your questions. Please do not share any personal medical information or questions in the chat box. If you have a personal medical question, please ask your doctor. Diana, would you like to pull up your slides?
Absolutely.
Great. So next, I would like to introduce you all to Diana Brenner-Miller. Diana is a pediatric speech language pathologist in the Department of Speech, Language, and Swallowing Disorders and Reading Disabilities at Mass General Hospital. Diana is trilingual and speaks Russian and Spanish in addition to English. She specializes in working with children with communication delays and disorders from multilingual backgrounds. She joins us today to give a talk on raising a bilingual child. So please join me in welcome Diana.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here to talk about a topic that raises a lot of questions worldwide, and that is the whole business of raising a bilingual child. And in terms of disclosure, as Amy mentioned, I'm employed at MGH as a speech language pathologist, and I receive a salary. And so parents, grandparents, family members, or maybe even expectant parents, congratulations, you've made such an important decision for your family to raise your child with more than one language. It could be that you want them to connect with your heritage and your family members, or it could be that you didn't come from a different language background, but you want your child to have a different experience and be a little global citizen. These are wonderful goals and such noble intentions. And I think, though, people don't talk often enough about how hard it can be to raise a bilingual child. And parents may also feel discouraged in some situations based on the mixed messages that we often get in society. On the one hand, we may hear something like, wow, this little girl is only 5 years old and she already speaks 3 languages. She's some kind of genius. And then on the other side of that, we may hear things like, are you sure you want your child to learn 2 languages at the same time? Aren't you worried about delays? And don't you want to prepare them for school? So there are a lot of questions related to bilingualism in general. And our goals for today are to address some of these frequently asked questions related to early communication development, related to school, as well as language maintenance for children learning 2 or more languages. So these are some of the questions that we're going to be answering today. And as you can see, this presentation is really best for people that have a young child in mind, so maybe infant kind of through early school age, not the best presentation for, let's say, adolescents that want to be bilingual for the first time, or adults. So I'm sure a lot of you are wondering about me and what my stake is in this whole topic. Well, as Amy mentioned, I primarily work with children from diverse language backgrounds as a speech language pathologist. And actually, I'd probably say about 90% of my caseload is comprised of children who come from a family where a language other than English is spoken, and that's either exclusively or in addition to English. So I've had a lot of work experience in this area, but this is also a personal topic for me as well, because even though you probably can't tell because I don't have an accent, I was actually born in the former USSR in what is today Ukraine. And you can see my baby picture from that era. And I moved to the US when I was about 7.5, my summer between 2nd and 3rd grade. I started 3rd grade, was kind of just plopped into a regular classroom in the American suburbs, and had to figure out really quickly how to communicate in English and participate in class. And it was difficult, both academically and socially. But before I knew it, things started connecting. And by my start of 4th grade, I already felt like that was not an issue for me. And I hadn't really looked back on it. And to this day, I'm really grateful for that experience because that's what led me to being bilingual in the first place. And I enjoy speaking my first language of Russian with my family almost on a daily basis, as well as with some of my extended family that still lives in Ukraine. And this is a picture of my visit with that extended family from about 2 years ago. And along the way in my life, I also was exposed to Spanish from school. That seed was really planted in middle school and high school when I was taking Spanish as a foreign language class. But when I got to college, I became really, really interested in that language from studying abroad. And I loved Spanish so much that I actually moved to Spain and worked in a bilingual elementary school for a year. And the last picture is of me in sunny Spain, which is very different than our weather here today in the greater Boston area. So growing up and learning different languages has been a part of my life, basically almost since I can remember. And it's been such a fulfilling part of my life. It's given me the opportunity to speak with all sorts of different people, to travel and be more adventurous than I probably would have been otherwise. And it's really given me the insight into how other people think just by having the experience of having different languages. And I think this is a reason why I wanted to do this presentation today, because I want everyone to have that experience of this is something that's important to you, because it's such an enrichment to your life. It's kind of for me like the cherry on top of the pie. And I want that for you, and I want that for your children as well. A lot of you may also be wondering, well, have you done it? Have you actually raised a bilingual child yourself? Have you done the work? Well, that is hopefully in the plans. And the great thing about this presentation is that it's allowed me to do some nice research on this topic. But for me, I do have personal experience being on the other side of things as a child, growing up with a language, and then also learning another language as an adult and going through that journey. So now that we have the background, let's really jump into our topic today. And we're going to dive right in with a pop quiz to get us warmed up. So I will present a few statements and I want you to think about the accuracy. So myth or fact, a bilingual person speaks 2 languages fluently. This is a myth. Actually, being a balanced bilingual where you have the same skill set in both languages is pretty rare. And that's simply because people don't tend to have their life exactly split between their languages. Myth or fact, across the world, there are at least the same number of children learning 2 or more languages as 1. This is a fact, and it's an important fact because it tells us just how common bilingualism or multilingualism actually is. Myth or fact, children are like sponges. They're going to become bilingual if they grow up hearing 2 languages. Unfortunately, this is a myth, and sadly, most kids growing up in the US lose the ability to speak their home language in favor of English. And we're going to talk a little bit about this today and why it happens and what we can do to help. And finally, a doctor, teacher, or other professional will know the right language recommendations for my family. This is also a myth. And it's a myth because there are a lot of misconceptions about bilingualism that we've had in our society in the US for at least 100 years. they've been so widespread that they've just been ingrained in our minds. And a lot of times we'll repeat things that are incorrect, but we don't even question the validity of that. We have a lot of wonderful people in our lives, very caring providers, educators, speech language pathologists that may want the best for you and your child, but may not be equipped with the most up-to-date information. And so if you hear things that don't necessarily resonate with you, I would encourage everyone to do your own research, because the recommendations about bilingualism have changed drastically in the past several decades. So now we can jump into our topic. And usually when we think about children and bilingualism, one of the first questions is, does bilingualism cause delays? You know, will I be putting my child in some kind of risk for having a language delay if this is something that we're interested in doing? Well, let's talk about communication development and some of these early milestones that we see here on the screen for children learning one language. So we all have a rough idea about milestones for babbling, for first words, for combining words. By 3 years of age, children should be speaking in sentences, and they should be, their parents should be able to understand pretty much everything that they're saying. And then in school age, about 7% of school age children have a language disorder. Not many people really know what this is, although it's very common, and I believe it's about 5 times more common than autism. Okay, so now that we know what happens with monolingual children, let's think, how could this be different for our bilingual children? And as you can see here, it's really not that different. So children that are exposed to 2 languages should be meeting their milestones right on track and on par with their monolingual peers. And in terms of bilingual children with language disorders, they're not at any more risk of developing a language disorder or having it increase in severity. So bilingualism does not cause language delays or language disorders. We can put that worry to rest. And this really makes sense because of what we had just talked about earlier, of how common bilingualism is. It's really the rule. It's not the exception, and it's not something extraordinary. And this really makes sense because if more than half of the world, in fact, some estimates say even up to 2/3 of the global population speaks 2 or more languages, you know, we definitely don't see 2/3 of the world walking around with some kind of language delays or disorders. Inevitably, we also have questions about language confusion. Well, my child says this in English and something else in the other language, and doesn't that mean that they're confused? Let's talk about this a little bit. So why did children do this? They do this because it's just simply available to them. We don't really have an equivalent for children who only speak one language. So it can be a little concerning because maybe we're not used to seeing that much. But children are usually doing this because they're just pulling up the words that come up first, and or they're using the stronger language to support the weaker one. My favorite part about language mixing, and the technical name is code switching or code mixing, is that it's not only used by children. Adults do this all the time too. And I personally do this probably every single time I have a conversation in Russian with my family. Inevitably, I'll need to think of some Russian word, and I either haven't used it in 5 years, or maybe I've never used it in my life, or I just can't remember it. And then I may switch over in English. And interestingly enough, no one seems to be worried about me being confused. And I think we should give the same leeway to the kids in our life. So we know that they're not confused. They know what they want to say. They know that the 2 languages are different, obviously, from a certain age. But they're just actually doing something really nice, and they're maximizing all of their language resources to communicate, which is a very positive thing. So it's information like this that informs policies that we have. And we actually have a policy on young dual language learners. It's from the US Department of Health and Human Services and the US Department of Education. And in that policy, they conclude that there's no scientific research to suggest that learning multiple languages or being bilingual can lead to a developmental delay for children. So when in doubt, if you have family members or friends that may question what you're telling them, you can always reference this information. So the bottom line is, don't let bilingualism be the scapegoat. If you're seeing your child struggle with something, and maybe it's a language delay, maybe it's something bigger, a lot of times bilingualism is kind of like low-hanging fruit. It's right there. It's an easy punching bag. But I want you to think beyond that, because we really shouldn't be seeing delays or those kinds of things. And I would encourage you to speak to the providers in your child's life. So what about if we already know that the child will be delayed? What if they have some kind of diagnosis like autism or Down syndrome, or they're premature, or maybe they're just late to talk and we don't really know why? What do we do then? Is it better to just switch to one language? This topic is very personal to me because this is 100% of the children that I work with. They all have some kind of difficulty with communication. And the first thing that we should know is that these children absolutely can become bilingual. They can learn two languages to the same extent they learned one. At MGH, one of the clinics that I work in, it's the Down syndrome clinic. And it's a wonderful program. And I love my role in that, especially with multilingual families, because I can help guide them and say, no, don't worry about it. You know, speak your languages to your child. They absolutely can do this, and it's not going to hold them back. And let's talk a little bit more about that, what we expect. We know that they're going to have trouble with language, no matter what language it is. But when we look at the research, like this review by Kay Rainingberg and colleagues of all of the studies to date that fit their criteria of children with communication delays in 3 groups: autism spectrum disorder, language disorder, and Down syndrome. They compared children who came from a monolingual background and children who came from bilingual backgrounds. And they concluded that simultaneous bilingual children, so those who are learning 2 languages from birth, they performed about equivalently or better than monolingual controls. So when they looked at the language skills of these kids, they saw the kids with autism spectrum disorder that are bilingual look like the ones with autism spectrum disorder that are only learning 1 language. And it was really the same across all of these groups. In fact, the only time the bilingual children performed worse was with a group of children on the spectrum whose moms were speaking to them in a non-native language. So right now, there is no scientific evidence that speaking 2 languages or even removing a language will eliminate or improve communication difficulties. And it's important to think why that is. And really, it's because removing a language or adding a language, it's not going to change the child's underlying difficulty with language in the first place. And so, to put it succinctly, monolingualism is not a cure for a language disability. So now that we've gotten those concerns out of the way, let's dive into the fun part. How should I raise my child to be bilingual? What is the best way? What do I do? It's very helpful to start off with a goal in mind, because that's going to inform everything that you're going to plan to do. And really, our goal needs to be for the non-English language, because if your children are growing up in the US, we know they're going to speak English. And so when we think about the non-English language, what do you want your child to be able to do? Are you happy if they understand what's being said and just at that level without them speaking? Or would you like your child to be able to have simple conversations in the target language? Maybe you want them to have an advanced level of spoken proficiency. And what about reading and writing? Is that something important to you as well? depending on your goal, you're going to need to put in either more or less effort for your child to be bilingual. And how do we do this? Well, what do you think of this statement? The best way to raise a bilingual child is for one parent to speak one language and the other parent to speak the other, avoiding language mixing when possible. So this is also another myth. And the reason it's a myth is because there really is no best way to raise a child to be bilingual. It all depends on your family makeup, on the dynamics, and all of the factors that you have in your lives. One size does not fit all. So the strategy that we were talking about is, it's very common and it's a really good strategy for a lot of people, but it may not be the best strategy for everyone. And it's called the one parent, one language strategy, where one parent sticks to one language, another parent sticks to the other language, and that's how they communicate with the child. There are also other strategies. Some of you may have choices of strategies to use, and some of you may not. But to go over some of the different ways that children can be raised bilingually, you can also have minority language at home. This is when both parents speak the non-English language exclusively, and the child learns English in the community, at school, and so on. You can also incorporate time and place strategies. And these kinds of strategies are not based on the person, but they're based on the time of day, or the day of the week, or different routines that you may have. So for example, some people may choose to speak to their child in one language on weekdays and another language on weekends. Some people may choose to speak to their child in one language in the mornings and another language at night. This can be a little bit tough because the boundaries aren't quite so clear, and it's not that the child necessarily needs those boundaries for some kind of optimal brain development, but it's just really helpful to keep you consistent and to set clear expectations to your child about what language we're trying to target. But time and place can actually be very useful for some families. For one, it's a great tool for maybe some families who want to raise their child to speak more than two languages, so multilingual. Maybe one parent could speak one language with the child, and the other parent may want to use time and place to target the two additional languages. Time and place is also really nice for families or parents who may have somewhat limited language skill themselves, where it's just not realistic for them to speak in the target language all day long. And they may choose to speak the target language in certain routines, like maybe a book time at the end of the day, or in the morning while they're getting ready for school and they're having breakfast, and that may be something more manageable. And finally, there's a mixed language policy, which is basically the no rules rule, and you just speak whatever language comes up. It could be a really nice strategy, but it doesn't work so well in environments that where multiple languages are not being used equally by society. So probably not going to be the best plan in a place like the US. If your child's going to an English speaking school, it may be a little hard. Now, what not to do, a few words of advice. You don't need to translate for your child. It's a little bit unnatural, and it just impedes the quality and the flow of conversation. So kids can figure out what you're teaching them without that need, even if they're really just getting started learning your language. You don't want also to create drastic shifts in language use with your child, because language is really the vehicle of communication and the vehicle for your relationship with them. We want them to feel a sense of stability, safety, and routine, and we can't rip that carpet up from under them. So any shifts in language should be very gradual and natural. And finally, we don't want to put off bilingualism. I know some families think, well, maybe I'll start with English now and get my child ready for school, and then when they're school age, I'll introduce the home language. But I think we all know it gets a little bit harder as time goes on, and you're also building that relationship with your child in one, in one language, and to change that, it's going to feel very strange and unnatural. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in bilingualism, starting now is better than later. So now that we've thought about a few things, we know our goal, we maybe have thought about our strategies, it's time for us to make a language plan. The first place I would encourage you to start is taking stock of your variables and being realistic with your situation. The first thing that you really need is to make sure that your partner is on board. And this is even more important if your partner doesn't speak the target language, because you're going to need that extra support from them to understand your mission, to understand why it's important for you to teach your child to speak, maybe your heritage language. And you're going to need their encouragement to help the child feel that speaking that non-English language is something incredibly special. You will also want to think about your skills in the target language. I know for me, English is my strongest language and my skills in the other languages are more limited. So it's going to be more challenging than speaking English, and it's good to consider that up front. We need to consider, what is the language of the main caregiver? A caregiver could be a daycare, a preschool, a person, a babysitter, a parent. And basically here we want to know, how much time is a child really spending in a certain language? And what about extended family members? Are they nearby? Are they able to support you in your goal? And finally, and this can get very uncomfortable for some people, is how will you handle majority language situations? Say you're trying to teach your child to speak French, but you're also a fluent English speaker, and you're in an environment with friends and or family, and English is the language being spoken. Are you going to stick to French with your child in those situations? Is that something that's comfortable for you? Or do you feel that maybe it's impolite and you're not comfortable with that and you would prefer to switch to English? It's good to think through these situations because they're going to come up. And I would encourage everyone to find the strategy that feels the most comfortable and natural for you, and decide what kind of level of strictness you want to maintain with the languages. So when you've thought of that, the first step to really starting your action plan is to ensure adequate exposure to the target language. Exposure needs to be frequent and consistent, and it should be a considerable percentage of the child's day or week. So how much exposure do children need to speak a language? Well, lots of studies have shown us that children who get less than 20 to 25% of input in a language are unlikely to become active bilinguals long term. So it may work for a little while, but over the long haul, it may be too hard for them to keep speaking the target language. And so what this looks like is that for a child that's awake, let's say 12 hours a day, during the course of the week, they would need to be hearing the target language about 17 to 21 hours to stay actively bilingual, that is, to be able to use that language long term. And children who get less than that, they can certainly continue to develop their comprehension of that language, which is wonderful, but it may be too hard for them to speak it. And so they'll be passive bilinguals, or I like the word receptive bilinguals, because it's, I think, a much nicer kind of word that highlights the important skills of just even understanding a different language. So it is a lot of hours. And unfortunately, it gets harder as the kids get older. So this is a very classic scenario that happens with many children. An infant that's born into a household, let's say maybe they're being cared for at home by their mom, who speaks with them in Spanish, and dad speaks in English. Let's say that the parents use, in the evenings and on weekends, the child is hearing exactly half and half of English and Spanish, but during the week, the mother is taking care of the child, and you can see how much Spanish input the child is getting. Then the child may get a little bit older, start preschool, and if they may start an English speaking preschool, let's say 5 half days a week, 5 mornings, and you can see the English starting to creep in and become a more considerable percentage of their weekly language exposure. But inevitably, as children get older and older and they're spending more time in school and after school activities and friends, the English really creeps in. And so the point of this is to help visualize that it is very difficult to ensure enough exposure to the target language. And so don't beat yourself up if it's not working out for you, if your child isn't speaking the target language, because this is why, and it's really hard to combat this. Finally, one last note, don't forget about the siblings. They are wonderful little people that support you and your family and just make things wonderful, but they can be a little bit disruptive to our plans sometimes, because even though we're trying to speak the target language, when we're not around, we know that kids are speaking to each other in English because it's the language of school, it's the language of kids, and it's the language they tend to want to speak with each other. And if your children speak to each other in the target language and they're school age, please email me because I want to know what you're doing. That's working so well. So I'm sure some of you are sitting here and thinking, what if I can't get enough hours? The first thing I want to say is, having your child even understand the language is such an important step. Don't devalue that. That is fantastic. And it's really a launching point for your child to be able to speak that language in the future if they so choose. Because when we get to be adults and have motivation and our own goals, that will be such a nice launching point for them. So that is a very important skill if your child even just understands what's going on. But if you can't get enough hours, there are some tricks that you can do to kind of cheat the system a little bit. And the first trick is to increase the quality of time that you have together. So say you only have about maybe 6 hours or 8 hours a week to dedicate to the language. Well, let's talk about increasing quality. And the two things that I want you to do are to have a regular book routine with your child in the target language and to have a regular play routine with your child in the target language. This is about 1,000 times more effective than things like flashcards or rote learning or Duolingo, because your child is engaging in a meaningful interaction that's fun, that's dynamic, that's important to them, and they're doing it with their favorite person, and that's you. The other thing that you can do is think if there's a way to increase the size of that language community, because research tells us that even if a child is hearing the same number of hours of the target language, if they hear it from more people, it's more effective. So now we can get into one of our other common questions about how to prepare your bilingual child for school in English. And it's important to start by thinking, well, what are the factors that are related to academic success in general? And numerous studies tell us that children that tend to be most successful in school have parents with a higher level of education, with a higher family income, which also impacts the school district and the amount of support they receive. They tend to have strong overall language abilities. Those are things like, for example, vocabulary size. They have some solid early literacy skills. So these are kids that are usually read to at home. They go into kindergarten, they may know some letters, they may know some nursery rhymes. And they have these skill sets, this school readiness. So they may have, they may know that when they go into kindergarten, they have to sit down at circle time and listen and kind of follow their routine, which may be different for children from some other cultures where there is not that expectation. So what about English and how does it fit in here? Well, English skills are helpful, but they're not obligatory to making sure that your child is successful in school. And really, it's kind of an interesting relationship. The more risk factors a child has for starting off school, kind of not on the right foot and needing more support, the more English becomes important. But the more children have protective factors like a high parent level of education, like having had a lot of books at home, the less important English becomes. So it's really a balance. This is also another common worry for a lot of people. Do bilingual children need to learn twice the amount of information? And this is also another myth. It doesn't quite work like that. We know that skills between languages transfer. So if children understand concepts and ideas in one language, they're going to pick it up once they're exposed to the other language much more quickly because they've had that idea already. If children can read in one language, they're going to make that jump into reading in the other language much more quickly. Same with storytelling and using complex sentences. And this is all because languages have shared cognitive aspects that's a little complicated and it's hard for us to see. But basically, the equipment is all there, and now it's just the wiring that needs to be changed. So I think one of the biggest myths out there is that English only is better. And the first thing that we need to understand when thinking about school and school performance is that parents don't have to give up the home language for their child to learn and progress in English. They can absolutely do this simultaneously. It's not mutually exclusive. And we also know that children who receive instruction in English and their home language, they do better in reading and math. They're more likely to get good grades on tests in not only in their home language, but also in English. And they actually show a higher level of English language proficiency, which I always find very interesting and a little bit counterintuitive. So really the home language is key. And this is what the research is showing us these days and also where it's headed. And I'm curious to see what we'll learn in the next decade. But we also know that now that children who continue to speak the home language in addition to English, so these probably a little bit older children, maybe middle childhood, adolescents, that if they continue to speak the language of their parents, and not only English, we know that they have better relationships with their families. They show higher academic achievement. They're more likely to graduate from high school and they have fewer behavioral problems. And really the language is, well, why is that happening? It's the link to your family and to having a relationship and knowing how you fit in and being proud of your ethnic identity. So recommendations for parents: speak to the child in the language you are comfortable using. You want to build a strong language foundation to support thinking, learning, and reasoning skills in any language. That's your number one priority when thinking about, school success. And you want to support early literacy skills and development in any language. So now that we've got that covered, we're coming to our last question, but also a very common question. What do I do if my child only wants to speak in English? Unfortunately, children from a very young age figure out that English is an important language. It's the language of school, it's the language of children, it's the language that things happen in, and they start to prefer it very early on. If you see that your child is starting to communicate with you almost exclusively in English, or even you're noticing that English is starting to creep in more and more often, the first place I would start is by asking, does the child have sufficient language exposure to actually use the target language? If not, I would maybe try to go back to your plan and see where can we work in opportunities to increase the exposure. But if you're a parent that says, but I speak to my child only in the target language and they're still talking to me in English, there's a very important caveat. And it's that it's not enough to just listen to a language. In order for children to speak the language, they actually have to use it. And what happens here with children is that we either have upward cycles or we have downward cycles. So the upward cycle, the more children use the language, the more likely they are to keep using it, and that reinforces itself. And it's vice versa for a child that's kind of starting to lose that home language. So how do we get the child to use it? What is the magic formula? Well, we talked about exposure, but there's one more thing, one more component that we need. Any ideas on what it could be? Well, the answer is that the child needs to feel a need to use that language. Because if they don't feel like they need to use the language, they're gonna end up doing what they want to do. And usually at some point in their development, the want is going to be English. So how do we get them to feel the need to use it? Well, I would start off by building a sense of pride in your child for using that language. And this I can speak to from personal experience growing up. I've had a lot of immigrant friends as a child in school, but some of them I noticed really just swerved and picked English. And they were actually kind of trying to hide the fact that they spoke another language at home. It was something embarrassing for them, and they just wanted to fit in as much as possible. But on the other hand, myself and even my sister, who was born in the US, we never had that feeling. We always, I think, felt proud of speaking our language, and we looked at it more as a special skill than something to be ashamed of or something strange or weird. And so I think it really all starts with planting that seed and making the child understand how special that actually is. We also want to set clear expectations for our children. So if your child is starting to speak English, do they actually know that you want them to speak the target language? You may want to have conversations with your children around the fact, well, at home, we speak this language because it's our family tradition, or it's really important for you to speak mommy's language because I want you to be able to talk with your family and your cousins and go on trips and so on. If your child is starting to talk with you in English, you also want to make sure that you're always, always, always responding in the target language. A lot of times parents will inadvertently switch into English without even realizing it. And so we want to be conscious of the fact of what language we're speaking and modeling for our child, and stick to that target language and be consistent. So what do we do next? Well, if you feel like your child actually may not know how to say something in the target language, I would encourage you to give them a model. So for example, if you're asking your child about the weather and the child says, yeah, it's raining and it's very windy outside, but you want them to say that in the target language, so let's say maybe Russian, you may want to model that. На улице много дождя и сильный ветер. So you're giving them the words and then try to see if maybe they could repeat that in certain ways, or go on to use those words in a little conversation now about weather. If you think your child actually knows the words and is just choosing not to use them, you can use another technique, and that is to act clueless. It's really amazing how well this works, even for really bright children that are school age, that know that you speak both languages fluently. But if they tell you, yeah, it's raining outside and it's really windy, giving them a simple confused face and a pause can work wonders. And finally, providing lots of praise for your child, continuing to tell them how important it is for you to hear that target language and what a good job they're doing. That can go a really long way to get them excited about using that language with you. And If you're really struggling, the magic trick, the spark to set your child on the bilingual journey is really to take trips to where that language is spoken, because they'll be able to see how important it is. They'll be able to interact with a lot of different people who speak it. They'll be exposed to it, 24/7 when they're there. And it can really reset that language foundation and interest for your child and put them on the path toward bilingualism if they're starting to fade a little bit. So the general guidelines for all of you are to define your goals. Create a realistic plan. We want to support the non-English language as much as possible. We want to be consistent. We need to think about adjusting the plan during critical periods like transitions to school. We want to have patience because we know it's a marathon. And finally, never, ever, ever give up. It's never too late, and keep up that good fight. Because we know that language is more than language, it's more than vocabulary, it's more than grammar, it's really our heritage, our identity, it's a way that we communicate culture and our beliefs. And so I'll leave you with some resources that may be of interest to you if you wanted to take a screenshot of this, some books, websites, and even a really fantastic podcast. And here are my references for today. And now I think we can move to some questions.
Thank you so much, Diana, for a wonderful presentation. We are toward the end of the session, so if you have any questions for Diana, feel free to enter them in the chat box.
I'm seeing a lot of people ask about the resource slides, so let me reshare that. I apologize if I moved too quickly on that one. I feel like I'm so used to taking snapshots, screenshots so fast these days.
And as I mentioned toward the beginning of the session, we are recording this session. It will be posted on the Blum Center website. So if you're interested, feel free to visit our website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center, and you'll be able to see the recording. I would give it about at least a couple of weeks for it to get posted, but it will be eventually there. Right.
Okay, so let me reshare. And here we are.
So while you do that, we do have a number of questions. First question. We are in the process of adopting a child, likely not an infant. At what age can we still introduce a language other than English and have it work well for the child? My husband's first language is not English, so he is a native speaker of the language we would introduce, which is Portuguese.
Wow, that is a really interesting situation. I would probably say I would need to know a lot more about the factors. First of all, congratulations on the adoption. That's so exciting. I think I would need more information to answer a question like that because it's a complex question. But what I can recommend to you is that you may want to, when your child is adopted, if you don't have this information already, is to understand more about what language skills they're coming into the process with. And a lot of times we would recommend having a speech and language evaluation. If you can't get it in the country where they're from with a speech language pathologist that speaks that language, as soon as you come to the United States, getting their language skills evaluated. And in that language that of the country where they're from before they forget it. That's very helpful information to have in terms of thinking about language skills overall.
Thank you. Next question. Do they meet their milestones in both languages in parallel? For example, one word in English, one word in another language around age 1.
Really good question. And the answer is no. It all depends how often they're hearing each language. So some kids may hear both languages about equally. Some kids may hear one language a lot and another language just a little bit. So it all depends. But I would say overall, we want the child to be meeting those milestones in any language, or even better in both languages combined. And so when you think, for example, it's very easy with the earliest milestones, does your child say 25 words or 30 words? And you want to think about both of the languages, not just one language at a time.
For bilingual kids, were those metrics based on their home language, English, or both languages?
So I think we're talking about that chart with the milestones. Those are based on both languages.
My grandson was in a Chinese daycare and was fluent and understood a lot. 2 years ago, the family moved out of the state. Is it worth keeping up with him when I visit him every few months? The last time I talked to him, he said he had forgotten about the language.
Oh, what a fantastic question. And it's a really hard one. I think the thing with kids is, we all talk about as a society, well, kids are amazing. They just absorb the language, they pick it up so quickly. The downside of being a kid is that you also lose the language very quickly. I would say it clearly seems like this language is very important to you. And I would want you to continue to support that language. But if I would say if the child is not understanding what you're saying and you're only visiting them a few times a month or a few times a year or once in a few months, it may just not be enough for you to make that connection for your child. And it may be a hard dynamic if they're not understanding anything you're saying and you're talking in completely different language. That may not be great for your relationship. So I would say maybe showing your child that that language is important, talking about it, maybe listening to music or doing something that's really fun, or even reading a little story might be a nice way to maintain that cultural connection for your child with that language in a way that's not too overwhelming for them.
So speaking of activities, this is a good segue to the next question. What are some activities to involve children to speak in other languages when they refuse a book, even cartoons in other languages?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would go back to that slide that we were looking at about increasing quality. And I would encourage you to try just playing with your child together in a game that they love. And if your child is resistant to the language, I would probably start off by just not placing any kind of demands on them and just you speaking that language and having them around it and getting used to that idea would probably be a really nice first step.
Thank you. If you have one parent who speaks a second language and the other parent neither speaks nor understands this language and want to implement a one parent, one language type approach, is it okay to speak in English when both parents are interacting with a child and then use a second language if that parent is one-on-one with a child? Or is there a recommended approach to navigating this? Or a recommended approach other than one parent, one language in this situation?
Really great question, right? So life is really gray and we don't have these little boxes to help guide us. And the answer is it all depends on how strict you want to be. And I've thought about this question too, because I'm in a similar situation, even though I don't have kids yet. I'm obviously really interested in this topic and I'm thinking about it. And there's the language of one parent, then there's the language of the other parent, and then there's a shared language. What I can tell you in terms of what's going to be the most quote unquote successful approach of actually getting your child to speak the language, well, that's going to be if you keep trying to speak that target non-English language with them all the time, even when you're with the other parent, but that's not always realistic. And if you and your partner have a relationship in English, that might cause also a little bit of friction. Like, why are you trying to speak this other language all the time around me now? I want us to be able to communicate together. So I would say decide with your partner together, what the boundaries are and what you're comfortable with. And if you're not comfortable speaking that target language exclusively with your child when you're in family situations, that's okay too.
Do you recommend that the parent who is less strong at the target language try to speak it as well, even though they may make mistakes?
Really good question, and very common. The general advice is to speak a language that you feel comfortable in. So I probably would say if you're really not comfortable in that language, like say you're trying to teach your child your high school French and you can barely string a sentence together, maybe not the best language models for your child. But if you have skills in that language, it takes some effort for you, but you can do it, and you can still give your child, adequate sentence structure, adequate vocabulary. Maybe you make a grammatical mistake here and there. That's okay, because having that link to your language and your culture is just priceless. So I would say sometimes it helps to have those really structured situations, like reading books in that language is really nice. You don't have to think about vocabulary and grammar or any of that. You just read and you can talk about what's happening. That can take a little bit of the pressure off. Or you can think about, okay, well, kind of those time and place strategies that we talked about. Maybe I can just start off by doing bath time in that target language, and I'm going to look up all the vocabulary for the toys and bath time and get really comfortable with that, and then maybe I'll expand to another activity, and you can also do it gradually like that.
That's great. I'm an American and my fiance is Italian. We live in Italy and plan to homeschool our children here, so they may get a lot of English but little Italian, which would be a problem. My question is, what are your thoughts on children being spoken to in one of the target languages by a non-native parent? For instance, me speaking to my children in Italian. I'm afraid that they will learn my errors or accent.
Yeah, so this is similar to the discussion we just had. I think it all depends. It really depends, again, on your level. If you're at a very basic level, I would say maybe you want to teach your child that language as more of a hobby in structured activities. If you're really struggling to use that language, I don't want you to talk all day, try talking all day long in that language with your child, because it's just not going to be realistic. And what we find too, this is the same advice we give parents in the reverse situation, parents that come from another country and are have really good intentions for preparing their kids for school, but don't really have even kind of conversational skills to keep that going. We say, speak to your child in your own language, but if you're comfortable speaking a language and you can support it and you can do it more as a hobby, or maybe you want to do it for certain parts of the day, that's wonderful. And you don't have to worry about your accent.
Thank you. How can we help our baby in a bilingual situation outside of the home different from the home target language? For example, Montreal is a bilingual city and the children are exposed to French and English. And at home, we speak Persian. Is it hard for a child, and what strategies are better?
Really good question. So the fact that the environment that the child is growing up in, not just the home, but the whole community is bilingual, is going to just do wonders for that child in order to use those languages. It's really hard if you're the only person, or maybe even as a family, you're the only ones supporting that language. It's hard. When there's a whole community behind you, it gets much easier. So overall, I think the question is referring also to, is that too much? Is that going to be okay for the child? Absolutely. There's really no limitations. I mean, there are limitations to how many languages we can all learn, but maybe they're, at 30. So we really don't want to worry about that. Your child is more than capable of learning 3 languages.
Thank you. So final question of the day. Any ideas on magazines for kids in Spanish?
Ooh, really good question. I don't know actually, but I'm sure they exist. And some other creative ideas I was thinking of too, if your children are maybe school age, is having Zoom available. I'm sure there are a lot of different groups where kids could meet other kids online, with parent supervision and support, like a little club and kind of like a modern day pen pal, but now you're actually getting to talk and interact with another child. So I think there's a lot of options. So if you learn of something good, you can also email me. And maybe, Amy, should I put my email in the chat?
Of course.
One more time?
Sure.
I think I showed it on a slide, but it may have been very quick. Great, so you should all see my email now.
Thank you, Diana. So it's about at 1 o'clock right now. Before we end today's session, Diana, any last words you'd like to share with the audience?
Keep up the good fight and don't give up.
Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Hopefully you found today's session helpful. As mentioned, feel free to visit the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center for the recording, and have a lovely rest of the day. Take care.